Thank you very much. We will move on to our first panel discussion, or panel of speakers, and then open discussion. But I just wanted to make a couple of technical points. This is a public open forum. It's being videotaped so that we will put it on our website. So just be aware that this is a public event, and that's one of the things we try to do always at AUB, to contribute to the public debate and to get ideas from this region and interactions with colleagues from around the world to get these into the global agenda if possible. So that's one thing. The other thing is, if any of the participants need any technical issues, we have several IFI staff members. Elisar, is Elisar here? She probably just stepped out. Dania Abbas and Rayan Elamin here next to me is the coordinator of the research initiative, and he and the staff have put a lot of work into this. So any technical issues that you need, we have several staff members who can help you out. The opening panel is designed to give us a quick overview of some of the key issues that we believe were drivers for these uprisings and continue to be drivers. Nada Al-Nashif is the regional director of the International Labour Organization, has worked based here in Beirut, has worked for many years in the Middle East with UNDP and ILO and other groups, and has a very deep knowledge of the region and particularly of some of the social issues related to labor. So Nada will be our first speaker, and then Jean Saeed Makdisi, who is an independent writer and researcher, former academic, still does academic writing, and has pioneered work and research among women, particularly in Lebanon and the region. And she will speak about gender issues related to the uprisings, while Nada will talk more about her field, which is labor, social security, and issues of that nature. So we'll start with Nada.
Thanks, Rami. Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
I think you have to speak closer to the sound.
Is that good? Okay. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a long time since I've been in an academic setting, so this is very daunting. So I hope you'll bear with me. I'm going to try not to step over the limits of the boundaries that Rami has said, which is labor issues. I'm trying to talk about the imperative of social justice from the perspective of labor in the Arab world. I'm going to start with the headings, the broad headings of freedoms and social justice as the broad headings of the uprisings, and really see this through the prisms of the demands for dignity, the idea of being treated as citizens and not as subjects anymore, and go from there. There are really very few empirical models, if any, that can explain causal chains that lead to tipping points, such as what we saw. But I think it's clear that this was a revolt against entrenched patterns of exclusion, of discrimination, and pervasive inequality, and especially skewed distributions of national income and wealth and access to opportunity. So perceptions of injustice were key. It was, I think, a rejection of the trade-off between socioeconomic and political rights, this idea of stability versus chaos, which continues, and the implicit slogan of economic reforms first and then perhaps political later, based on notions that adjustment hurts and democratic opposition can undermine it, and I'll come back to that. And clearly it confirmed that closed systems cannot maintain the status quo, and piecemeal reform at elite pace is not an option. And I think we'll see that the resort to traditional political and economic co-optation and bribery comes down to too little too late in the end, just by way of background. You get a very good sense of the gaps that were in place from the early responses of Arab governments. Starting with the Arab Economic Summit in January 2011, a quick announcement, $158 billion were announced through the years to 2030 for emergency action for Arab food security, and a 2 billion youth employment program was established. We haven't heard any more about either of those, by the way, but the Islamic Development Bank announced also very early on $250 million to fight poverty and unemployment, especially youth unemployment. Of course, the Gulf Cooperation Council rolled out its Marshall Plan, $10 billion each to Oman and Bahrain. Across the region, there were national initiatives to raise minimum wage, create new jobs, increase housing and social benefit, including unemployment schemes, restoring subsidies and scrapping taxation. The international community chipped in, aid and loan packages, the Deauville Partnership, and then it was expanded in Marseille by September of last year, and we're talking about a figure that reached $38 billion. And of course, all this led most recently to the political offer of union between Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, very much in the same spirit. So what was going on before? A little, perhaps, review of the pre-existing economic and social challenges. On the area of income equality and perceptions, again, of injustice, the evidence in the Arab region with regards to income inequality at the micro level is quite mixed regarding what was happening in inequality before 2010. But at the macro level, what is very clear is that the share of wages and consumption in GDP had declined, especially rapidly in North Africa, where the uprisings started and, of course, were more intense. And so, notwithstanding some trickle-down of the benefits of growth to individuals and families, clearly the wealth was accruing to presidents, their children, their families, and the insiders of the establishment. And so the perceptions of increasing inequality grew very much. If I can add a few things, fiscal consolidation and budget cuts, austerity measures gave rise to increased insecurity, whether it was real or perceived, which led to a lot more instability, of course. Although most Arab states enjoyed a renaissance in terms of rates of economic growth after the liberalization of the 1990s, these led to lower growth of government employment particularly, and of course the old social contract produced less and less over time. Higher food prices, and the rising food prices were, of course, associated with a lot of insecurity, and the removal of subsidies were central to some of the developments that were associated. The presence of an educated, increasingly educated, but increasingly then dissatisfied population, and the youth momentum, of course. The education system in the Arab world had actually expanded faster than any other region. To the point that the educated youth became a sizable minority, and then their aspirations, of course, could not be accommodated in the economic opportunities provided. So it wasn't necessarily that the standards of living themselves empirically were declining, but the opportunities were not improving as fast as the legitimate expectations and aspirations, particularly of young people. So a very elusive quest for fair and inclusive growth. And I want to recall the work of the Arab Human Development Report some years ago on the poverty of capability and opportunity. On the employment, I won't go through the background of statistics. Everyone is aware the lowest labor force participation rates in general for women, for young people, and if you're a young woman, you're doubly impacted. But some contradictions. So we had these high economic growth rates, high by historical standards, especially after the two lost decades preceding the pro-market reforms that were adopted. However, on a per capita basis, the increase in incomes in practically all Arab states were among the lowest in the world. Employment response was high in terms of quantity of jobs. So this is a little bit of a myth. There were enough jobs, some jobs being produced, but the quality of the jobs was the very big issue. The share of working populations and their families living on $1 and $2 a day declined, and in fact, the share of those in vulnerable employment also declined, but again, the reforms produced very little overall in terms of substantive employment creation for decent jobs, which is our issue. And then you have the idea that the jobs basically cemented the informal sector because of their poor quality, undermined pay equity, and therefore propagated both the poverty and income security across the board. On the social protection side, as Rami mentioned, this is a big area of certainly our own work. Protection took the form of various subsidies, food, energy, health, education, and it benefited a few insiders at high cost. And this is civil servants, military, judges. So despite the relatively good economic performance and some economic growth and traditions of social and family solidarity, coverage and benefit provision remained very, very poor. In fact, most assistance schemes in the Arab world take the form of safety nets and subsidies that are very poorly targeted, with insufficient administrative capacity and no accountability, fragmented implementation, and no coordination whatsoever. There is a very big disconnect between long-term benefits, old age, disability, employment injury, and the shorter term, whether maternity benefit or unemployment insurance, which has become a very big topic of priority in the Arab states. And of course, the approaches remain very much based on the welfare system rather than a rights-based entitlement approach. A closer look reveals that in many, many of our economies, the formal workers do not always enjoy the comprehensive social security coverage that is even promised in the law. Recent estimates go to suggest that national social security pension schemes, for example, cover on average about 34% of the region's workers. So about a third of all the workers have pensions. And that ranges from 8% in Yemen to 87% in Libya, whatever a pension meant in the old Libya. Several of these systems exclude employees working in small enterprises, very limited access to social security for women. There's one really comprehensive maternity benefit scheme in the Arab world, which is, and certainly in the Mashriq, which is in Jordan. And then the very low level of ratification of international labor standards mean that actually in practice there's very little incentive for governments to go ahead and work on these. Even in the Gulf, where there are generous benefits, there have been many criticisms leveled by international organizations, the ILO included, regarding the design and the performance of those schemes. And in fact, a number of systematic weaknesses exist there. These schemes overpromise benefit levels. They are unsustainable because of design deficits. They do not provide any incentive for labor market participation. They often work in the opposite direction to keep people satisfied and at home. And they have very inefficient, costly, and fragmented administration systems. So we have the challenges, or have had, and this is a little bit forward-looking, but really from the motivational part, the challenge of building an effective social protection floor, not the net to catch everybody when they fall, but really to make sure that they have the minimum from the beginning. The notion that there was no social security system embedded in a wider economic and social policy, so there was not really a comprehensive vision of what needed to be done in this area. The idea that these systems were critical for the effective functioning of labor markets and indeed productive employment. And there are many distortions until now resulting from, for example, from the differences in coverage between public and private sector coverage. And of course, the good governance of social security, which is a big issue. The final gap, perhaps, is in what we call social dialogue. The Arab region, of course, has had a significant and increasing void in the areas of voice and accountability. In fact, the lowest level of citizens' voice and government's accountability. And we have a forthcoming publication, a little announcement that I'll talk about later. But we have had a lot of lip service to institutional forms of participation in economic policy making. For example, a lot of support in theory to economic and social councils, but a chronic lack of political will to include workers and employers, what we call the social partners. These organizations have generally been absent from the economic and social debate due to the lack of viable tripartite structures and mechanisms, no enabling legislative environment, and the lack of necessary capacity in order that they can effectively participate. And more generally, there is rampant interference in their internal state of affairs. And this is interesting because we are now dealing a lot with the transition, especially on the workers' side, from old unions and federations to new. And this is a battle that runs across the political spectrum now. Weak trade unionism and relative underrepresentation of the labor force were some of the critical conditions that we faced before and were important determinants. And the reasons include, of course, a historic legacy of repression of workers' organizations, a decline in union density, obviously with the increasing unemployment, that's a vicious cycle, and the absence of the kind of popular participating which comes with democratic societies where you have a genuine alternation of power through civil society and political parties and other things. So there was very little influence of trade unions on the economic and social choices of adjustment. And we're generally concerned, of course, that this continues to be the case. The landscape has changed significantly and left unionism and trade unions behind, very much ill-equipped to deal with issues of deregulation, structural and technological change, unemployment, income inequality, and how the labor market is changing. More women, more migrants, a booming informal sector. The private sector was also not a level playing field that would allow sustainable enterprises with uncritical liberalization of the financial sector, footloose foreign direct investment, the real estate bubbles, the privatization of increasingly critical public services, and so on. So what was missing, perhaps just a little bit, my last 30 seconds on the way forward, the target for now, it means, is a new development paradigm that can put employment and equality at the heart of macroeconomic policy, so that we have a private sector that is transparent, competitive, and sustainable, so that we have universal, effective, and equitable social protection, so that reforms are negotiated and accepted between workers and employers, not enforced. And anyone who has followed the story of the electricity sector in this country over the last few weeks knows what this means. And that we have freedoms enshrined in systems and legal frameworks. Obviously, we need integrated reforms. There are lots of issues I haven't mentioned: managing migration, education and training, active labor market policies, and information systems. But I think we have a little bit more room for some calculated risk-taking, and I think we will need approaches that are consistent in principle and application without a blind eye to undemocratic partners and to the social and economic implications of reform. Thanks.
Thank you, Rami. I'd like to start out by pointing to a strange phenomenon. From the beginning of the revolutions of the last year and following, there's been endless commentaries on the women participating in these demonstrations. And I'm just astonished at the number of articles and the amount of words written on this subject. Of course, the first point to make is that there's absolutely nothing new about women participating in demonstrations, and anybody who knows anything about the 1919 revolution in Egypt, for instance, will know that the most famous picture of that revolution actually was the picture of hundreds of women wearing niqab and abaya and so on, marching through the streets of Cairo to face the British army, which did not hesitate to shoot into the crowd and in fact killed several women. So these demonstrations go back, way back. We, in fact, have records of women demonstrating in the streets of Damascus as long ago as 1810. So there's nothing, absolutely nothing new about women demonstrating. Of course, and participating in revolution. In Palestine, of course, we all know that women participated in various ways in the 1948 revolution or the 1948 war. Of course, and since then, always, and in the intifadas especially the first intifada. In Algeria, of course, it's well known that women had a huge hand in the revolution. So why is everybody, school children in Lebanon grew up, learn their modern history from a textbook that, and my children use this textbook, by the way, with a picture on the cover of the women's demonstrations for national independence in the early 1940s. So the question I'm asking really is, why has there been such a massive interest in the women's demonstrations in some places, and most particularly in Maidan al-Tahrir? For instance, I've hardly seen any commentary about the demonstrations in Yemen and Bahrain, or the women's participation in them. There are these women going absolutely contrary to stereotype, wearing their niqabs and their black abayas and marching through the streets, where the niqab and the abaya has always been taken, and especially today is always talked about as a form of subjugation and as a symbol of women's oppression and so on. And here are these women wearing it and as a sign of engagement, of political engagement. Why has there been no more comment on this? I think the reason is very clear. It's very difficult when a stereotype is so smashed as it has been there. Nobody knows what to say. And what about the apparent absence of women in the revolutions in Libya and in Syria? There was participation of women in these places until the military events began. Once the military took over, women disappeared from the streets, obviously, as did unarmed men and so on. A matter that's been commented on at great length is the gender-specific forms of violence that women faced in Maidan al-Tahrir. The infamous, notorious virginity tests, for instance, or the famous story of the girl in the blue bra who was beaten by the police, or any of these things. Of course, there's nothing new in that either. Women have always been, as have been men, subjugated, humiliated, and treated with violence, abused by the people they're demonstrating against. I mean, that's rather obvious. In short, to take the road of questioning why women participated in these large numbers is, to me, a dead end. They've always done so and probably always will. One of the questions that I would like to raise here is the interest of the future of Egyptian women, as it's constantly expressed in a discussion of the revolution, is it really an interest in women, or is it more a question raised about something else, i.e. the future influence of the Ikhwan and the Salafiyin and so on? I think the interest in women is really a disguised form of raising the other question. I don't think people are very interested in, worried about women. Perhaps I'm wrong. The question I want to raise, the real question I want to raise, is not why women participated, but why their political visibility seems largely limited to moments of great national crisis. The matter we need to investigate is the missing link between women's very visible participation in revolution and other national emergencies, on the one hand, and their almost total absence from political power in more normal terms. This is not a question we just have to ask ourselves about today's revolutions, but even about the 1919 revolution. Why were women so visible at that time, and then why did they sort of disappear into the background later? I think that the problem that we need to investigate here, the reason we haven't investigated this is that we are totally ignorant of our own history. And this is a subject on which I've written about for years and talked about for many years, and we need absolutely, especially in the history of the last couple of hundred years, a proper study of the status of women in the Arab world, that is, in the past, so that we can have some sense of a trajectory, so we can have some sense of whether we have, in fact, advanced or declined. It's my belief that we have declined. But women are always shown, and especially Muslim women, are always shown as having been oppressed, excluded from power, indeed totally powerless, ignorant, sexually abused, and so on. It's a widespread stereotype that is held as much by Arabs as it is by others. As recently as the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq in the last decade, the story of Western powers coming to rescue Arab and Muslim women, I mean, we all know these stories, but the interesting thing is to what degree Arabs themselves maintain that stereotype. In making this point, I in no way mean to romanticize the past of Arab women, nor do I wish to deny that Arab women today are in a very bad way and must continue to fight, as they have been doing for a very long time, for greater rights, as well as for social, political, and economic advancement. On the contrary, I am a firm believer in feminist demands and have fought in my own way for them since my early adult years. But I am also a firm believer that we must know our own history in order to better understand our present dilemma and how to deal with it. I believe this is the principal task of Arab women today, who wish to find a way out of the political impasse of the last at least 100 years. The study of women and their role in society and history is relatively young as an academic field, but in the Arab world it is, with very few exceptions, still largely excluded from the academic curriculum. This very university does not recognize women's I look accusingly at the provost. Does not yet, as far as I know, recognize women's studies as an academic field worthy of being taken on. To understand the path that women must take today, we must first understand the trajectory they have taken in the past, whether by their own will or by forces beyond their control, to bring us to the point we are at now. To understand how Egyptian women today, for instance, should plan for the future, we need much more work of the sort done by such scholars as Afaf Lutfi Sayyid Marceau's book Men and Women in Late 18th Century Egypt, Judith Tucker's Women in 19th Century Egypt, Amira Sumbul's work, all of it, Nellie Hanna's work, like Making Money in 1600, or her work on Cairene architecture. She did a study, in fact, she's done several studies of architecture, domestic architecture, to show how the house and the form houses took changed to reflect new political and economic realities. These are studies that we need absolutely to do in order to understand our past. The work of the Women and Memory Forum in Cairo, Multaqa al-Mar'a wa Dhakira, which is dedicated to republishing and investigating lost work by women such as Nabawiya Musa, Malak Hifni Nasif, and so on, is important at least in part for showing how women in the past thought and wrote about political and social issues. This is left out of the account of Arab intellectual history. There's a book, by the way, which I've seen here, published by AUB in the 60s, and it's called Arab Intellectual Life in the Arab World or something. And it's a whole book of, I'm not going to tell you who edited it because they're all friends, but it was published by the AUB Press, I can tell you that. The book doesn't have a mention of a woman in it. Therefore, the suggestion is that women contributed nothing to intellectual life in the Arab world. I think these are things that really, it's high time we got over. We need to get to the point that women's studies programs elsewhere have achieved, not only in the great Western universities, but even in places like the Indian subcontinent. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, they're doing amazing studies on women's history and women's literature of the past. It seems to me the importance of this, it's terribly, terribly important that we do this, because otherwise we end up with myths about the women's past, which can be extremely damaging. I'm just going to give one example of something that I've worked on personally. Everybody knows the famous story of Huda Sha'rawi going to the 1923 the 9th Feminist Congress in Rome in 1923. Right? Everybody knows this story. She came back, it is said, from Rome, was met at the train station by a mass of women, and at the train station, Huda Sha'rawi removed her veil, and all the women removed their veils, and everybody clapped. I thought this was a lovely story, and so when we had a conference right here at this university on Arab women in the 1920s, I took it as my task to investigate the story. I thought it would be a nice paper to work on. Well, I went to all the newspapers of the time that I could get my hands on. The Arabic newspapers, the Egyptian newspapers precisely. There wasn't a single mention of this story, not a single one. I went to all the women's magazines of the time, including a lot of the magazines that were published here, the women's magazines that were published here in Lebanon. Not a mention of this story. I looked at the foreign newspapers, all of which had followed the story of the 1923 Feminist Conference, and specifically the Egyptian delegation. Not a mention of this story. Now, I'm not a historian, and I did this study for a paper in a conference, and I'm not a PhD dissertation, so I'm not willing to go far enough to say it never happened, but I'm coming very close. But the damage of this story is that people, and I've heard it again and again in women's circles here, in the circles of the women's networking, Huda Sha'rawi was the first woman to raise the veil, and look at us now, we're going back to the veil, and look how bad the women's situation is. In fact, Huda Sha'rawi's great interest was in the nation, in politics. In fact, everything she did at the time, and everything that was commented on in those newspapers and in those in the women's press at the time, has to do with the national pride of Egyptian women now telling Western women where they are and what they want. This was a great achievement of Huda Sha'rawi, and it's never mentioned. It's always put in terms of that one moment, which I don't know the source of the story. All I can tell you is every single book I've ever looked at that deals with modern Arab women has this story in it without a footnote. So where it came from, I don't know. But this is all the more reason for us to think. I see my time is almost up. Let me just... So we have a stereotypical picture of Arab women having been dominated, sitting at home, doing nothing, oppressed, and so on, and therefore we don't really know the past. Amira Sumbul has said in one of her pieces, and I wanted to quote her, but there's no time, and anyway, I forgot to bring the book. She says there's absolutely no resemblance whatsoever between the popular understanding of women's past and the court records which show what women's lives were really like. Women in the 19th century, for instance, and we know this from Judith Tucker as well, and all these people who have done this kind of work on the court records, women went to court, women sued each other, women kept their property, they kept their thing, they were very powerful individuals within the family community, and so on. What happened? The question that we need to ask ourselves, I personally am convinced that the nation state has been very destructive to women, not only in the Arab world, but throughout the world. And I think that what we really need to investigate, and I'll just close with this, although it really was the subject of my paper, I don't have time to do it, that all of this was prologue to making this point. We need to study what happened when the Ottoman Empire gave way to the modern nation state in this part of the world. It has not been done. It's been done a little bit I've done a little bit of it in ways having to do with my personal family, but it's not been done on a large scale. What happened? How did women lose the kind of social power they had before? And what happened to put them into the prison of the modern laws on women? Because if you look at some of these laws, especially laws having to do with finance and economics and banking and all of that stuff, women are now in a much worse position than they were 100 years ago, or more than 100 years ago. Time's up. So I'll just leave it on that. Of course, I don't have time to say all the things I wanted to, but thank you very much.
Neda, you will have more time in the discussion, so thank you for sticking to the time. Just another logistical note. There is Arabic-English translation. If anybody would like to speak in Arabic, or for those of you who would like to hear the Arabic translation, there are speakers, headphones back there for anybody who wants them. I want to make a few comments about some of the data that we have now that is available, has been for a few years, and the most recent poll that was done by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Doha, and some of the work that was done by Gallup over the last 2 or 3 years, just to help, I think, focus a little bit of attention on two questions. The common sentiments that are so clear across the region in terms of people's grievances, but also the diversity of views. And what the data shows from the various polls is that really we have a major, it seems to me, we have one major divide in this region, which is the economic divide, the wealthy and the poor. When you look at the polling data from before the uprisings, from 2010, which was done by Gallup, they survey the Arab world twice a year for themselves, but also for Silatech, which is a group based in Doha that deals with youth employment issues. And they disaggregate that data by youth and adults, which is really interesting. I make 2 quick points about this. The differences between young people, which is 15 to 29, the differences in attitudes between young people and adults across the region are pretty insignificant. There are almost no differences, except on the desire to migrate. Young people understandably want to migrate more than adults. But if you look at issues like, for instance, people's sense of the honesty of the elections in their countries, and this was 2010, 2009, 2010, 2011, it didn't change much. This data is from 2010. About 34% of young people only 34% feel that elections were honest. And it's 36% for adults, negligible difference. When you look at young people's faith or trust in religious institutions, it's a high 86% for youth and 88% for adults. So both in the positive and the negative sides, the sentiments are very clear. So one of the things that we need to get rid of quickly is this idea that this was a revolution led by angry young people who couldn't get jobs, while most of the population is much more sensible. You look at the data about their feeling whether they can get good, affordable housing. Only 32% of young people felt they could get good, affordable housing. And these are figures for the whole Arab world. 32% of youth and 31% of adults. So this issue of youth and adults, I think, is a very important one, because what it tells us is that these young people who got out there first in the streets and who continue to go out in places like Bahrain and Syria and other places, these young people actually quite accurately reflect the sentiments of their entire populations. The second point that comes through pretty clearly from the data from the Gallup, again, 2010, when they divided the Arab world into high, medium, and low-income countries. The high income being the oil states, they account for maybe 10%, 12% of the Arab world. And the data there is again, quite striking. When they asked questions like, well, they divided the sentiments, people's perception of their well-being as thriving, if they felt that they were doing fine and the future was going to be good. If the medium was struggling, that they're okay, they have their basic needs, but they have to struggle to keep this going, and they're not sure of the future. Or suffering, which is they're in bad shape and the future is going to get worse. When they disaggregated the data by income, per capita income in countries, there was huge differences. For instance, 59% of respondents in the high-income countries said they were thriving, while it was only 12% in the low-income countries. And those 12% would be people like us, professionals or others who are in the government system, who make money, who are in the private sector. And when you look at suffering, well, if you look at the people who said they were suffering, it was only 1% in the high-income countries, but 12% and 13% in low and medium-income countries. And in the middle range, the struggling, the people who were getting their basic needs more or less, but it was a struggle, they weren't sure if they were going to keep being able to do this. The struggling category was 76% and 73% in the low-income countries. Three-quarters of the people thought they were struggling, but it was only 40% in the high-income countries. So we clearly have divisions across the region based on income rather than based on age. And you have similar things if you look at confidence in the government, for instance. The people in the wealthy countries feel the government's fine, most of them. In the low-income countries, they don't. The second point I want to make is the more recent data that has come out of the poll by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Last year, they polled 12 Arab countries whose populations represent about 85% of the Arab world. This was done from last February to last July, so right during the uprisings. And I'm going to just, Muhammad Masri was supposed to come, but he had a family issue and he couldn't come at the last minute. So he sent us a presentation, which is a long PowerPoint, which I can't produce. But I just want to quote a couple of things, a couple of quotes. And this is from last year during... No, I'm just giving you a couple of... Yeah, we'll have time to talk. I'm going to take 15 minutes, and then we're going to have 45 minutes or a bit more to talk. That's the schedule. But I'm providing some of these data just to try to give us a clear understanding of the foundation of the environment in which we are dealing in the Arab world. And this latest data from last year from the Arab Center poll shows that there was largely negative perception across the region in the general performance of the governments of those countries. Less than a third of all aggregated respondents across the Arab world expressed approval for their government, while 60% expressed dissatisfaction. And this, again, mirrors certain trends that were documented in many earlier polls. Citizens across the region, and it varies by country, of course, but broadly speaking, they have generally high confidence in the armed forces, which is interesting. And this has been like this for many years. I remember polls in the 70s and 80s in the Levant where people have confidence in the armed forces because they see them as defending the country, playing a national role. But they don't have confidence in the government, and they have complaints against the police or the intelligence agencies who feel don't treat them well. And this comes across, again, in the polling data here. Confidence in the parliaments is very low. There are great perceptions of injustice, and this is one of the things that comes through. In the definition, one of the important things that this poll produced is a very nuanced understanding of how Arab citizens understand democracy. And I think this data is available. It's on the website of the Arab Center. And the interesting thing were the different elements that citizens across the Arab world mentioned as defining democracy, how they understood democracy. And it included the guarantee of freedoms and civil and political rights, and it included issues of justice and equality, a democratic system of government, improving citizens' economic situation, and issues of security and stability. And there's a lot of other interesting data in this poll that looks at attitudes to what's the major threat that Arab citizens feel. And the two countries that were number 1 and 2 ranked by Arab citizens saying who they saw as their major threat were the United States, were Israel first and then the United States. So I think what this tells us, this gives us these polls and others give us some good data that helps quantify some of the sentiments across the region. More important, I think, is what we've heard in the last year and a half from the people of this region. And again, it's very different, and every country is very different. The response of the regimes is very different. But if we go back and try to define what are people saying? So we know how they feel from these polls and other things. We know what they're complaining about. But what do they actually want? And I think this is one of the important challenges for us as we go ahead, all of us, in the various research activities we do. What should we be researching? What should we be studying about what the Arab people in each different Arab country want? And I think a good way to get to that is to look at, well, what are they actually saying? What have they expressed in their protests and their writing and their media interviews and their discussions privately in their institutions of society? And I think if we go through that, I've noted down a couple of I guess we'd call them issues or sentiments or phenomena that people are expressing. And it's very interesting to see the very wide range. And this is what makes these uprisings and revolutions so complicated, and these transitions so complicated, is because people are dealing with such a wide range of grievances, and at the same time the transitional mechanisms, they're trying to deal with democratic change, economic development, justice system, transitional justice for the corruption and crimes of the past. They're trying to define constitutional mechanisms, issues of pluralism, defining the balance between religiosity and secularism, defining the balance between the central state and the provinces, defining the balance between the military and the civilian forces in society. Trying to address all of these issues at once is virtually impossible for any country to do simultaneously. But this is in fact what they're actually doing now in Tunisia and Egypt and Libya now starting its process. But when you ask, well, what is it that people are actually saying? My impression is that we can look at a couple of things. They're certainly expressing their identity. So a lot of these issues that we're looking at are just simple expressions of basic identities. They're expressing anger at past abuses, and that's important to document, because if there's going to be stable systems that come about, they're going to have to deal with putting behind us the grievances of past crimes that people feel they've been subjected to. There are expressions of empowerment. When people feel that the institutions of state are not legitimate or are not credible, they want to be empowered to be able to have their rights as citizens. So there's a quest for empowerment. Then there's obviously the broad issue of dignity. Dignity is not well defined. We have a research project that we've launched here at AUB with several professors looking at young people and how they interpret dignity across the Arab world. The issue of justice, similarly, is very powerful but ill-defined. People are looking at justice issues in different contexts. Basic freedoms are expressed across the board. People also want to express or to enjoy things like pride, respect, and trust. And these are these intangible elements are very, very hard to deal with, but they're very powerful. And this is what comes out of the actual events of what people are actually doing in the region, what they're saying. They talk about these issues, respect, trust, dignity, rights. And I think finally, I would say that we saw this in the actions of Mohammed Bouazizi, and we see it in the continuing uprisings all across the region, and the data shows this, and all of our research, I think, clearly shows this. We're dealing with a very complex mixture of material needs and political, psychological needs. That people need food and housing, healthcare, but they also need respect, dignity, trust, and a certain affirmation of their fundamental humanity, as well as their civil rights and political rights as citizens. So the complexity, I think, is finding the middle ground in these intangible and material needs that people have, which vary across countries because of the very different situations in every country. And that's what makes this process so challenging, but also so important. Thank you very much. Okay, we now open the floor for comments, discussion. We'll give priority to the participants in the symposium around the table, and then everybody else in the room. And I ask you please to identify yourselves and try to keep the initial comment or question down to about 2 minutes. We have about 45, 50 minutes. Ahmed.
It's on. Yeah, I just want to follow on Jean's last remark.
Yes.
There are studies that talk about how the rise of the Arab nation state destroyed the civil society that existed before or during the Ottoman Empire. All of the indigenous representative organizations, whether they are tribal, religious, professional, and so forth, were eliminated by the nation state and replaced by semi-official organization. Like if you look throughout the Arab world where it is allowed, you will find the unions are or became representative of actually the state rather than the people. And that created some disruption in the relationship between the state and social civil forces. And the only one that was left in a way or another to work and were able to continue were the religious movement, especially, when I'll talk about it later, religious movement that had some political tendencies plus other forms, and those especially that did not pretend to be working on political issues. Other than that, all forms of social representation or even contestation were destroyed completely.
Is it on? Okay, although I may talk in English, but I would prefer to talk in Arabic. هذه الندوة أو الجلسة كان الأساس النقاش فيها حول الدوافع الموتيفيشن، لكن بصراحة أنا ما لاحظت نقاش حقيقي أو من الأوراق اللي سمعتها ما يتعلق بالأسس المرتبطة بالدوافع وراء الانتفاضات العربية، وإن كان هناك بعض التلميحات مرتبطة بالعمالة أو بالموضوع المرأة. وبصراحة فيما يتعلق بالدوافع، يعني يمكن من باب التخصص احنا طلعنا على مئات الدراسات في السنة الماضية، لكن حتى الآن ما وجدنا دراسات حقيقية مقنعة فيما يتعلق بالدوافع. الكلام فيما يتعلق بالاقتصاد أو فيما يتعلق بحقوق الإنسان، الديجنيتي، الكرامة، موضوع الظلم اللي بيعيشه الإنسان، حالة الاستبداد والديكتاتورية في العالم العربي، حالة الفساد، هي حالة دائمة ومستمرة ومنذ حوالي 50 أو 60 سنة بيعيشها العالم العربي. لكن السؤال لماذا الآن؟ هذا السؤال لم يتم الإجابة عليه بالشكل الواضح. أنا أظن ربما يمكن أوضح أكثر برضو فيما يتعلق بالاقتصاد. لا يمكن أن يكون الاقتصاد سبب كافي للحديث عن الدوافع فيما يتعلق بالثورات العربية. الاقتصاد المصري مثلا في ال6 سنوات الماضية كان في أفضل حالاته، وكان النمو الاقتصادي في مصر بين 6 إلى حوالي 8%، وهو من أفضل الاقتصاديات من ناحية النمو. طب لماذا في مصر؟ أيضا في تونس تعتبر بلد مستقرة اقتصاديا قياسا بالبلدان العربية. إذا هناك أسباب أخرى. أنا أظن ربما، وكنت قبل شهرين من بدء الانتفاضات في العالم العربي التقيت في مؤتمر مع عبد المنعم أبو الفتوح والبلتاجي، وكان في حالة إحباط هائلة، وكانوا يتوقعوا أنه ممكن يحدث شيء خصوصا مع حالة التزوير في الانتخابات المصرية. أنا أظن أن هناك فعل تراكمي في عالمنا العربي. الفعل التراكمي أدى إلى الوصول إلى ما يسمى بالنقطة الحرجة، الكريتيكال بوينت، اللي هي كسرت حاجز الخوف عند الناس خصوصا من سلوك البوعزيزي. وبالتأكيد وسائل الإعلام الحديثة، وسائل التواصل الحديثة، الفيسبوك وتويتر وغيره، زاحت أو وسعت بشكل كبير العمل. دخول الشباب بشكل أساسي على الموضوع ساهم في كسر حاجز الخوف بشكل كبير. وأيضا سقوط النظام التونسي في أيام معدودة أعطى موتيفيشن هائلة للثورات في البلدان العربية بشكل كبير، أعطاهم شعور معنوي هائل بالقدرة على الإنجاز السريع، وهذا دفع عدد من البلدان بالمشاركة والدخول. أنا أظن أنه هذا أيضا يفترض أنه يكون في البال. النقطة الأخرى المتعلقة بتاريخ المنطقة. تاريخ المنطقة في العالم العربي، الذين لا يدرسون التاريخ من الصعب فهم الدوافع. هذه المنطقة فيها عادة ما يحدث أحداث مفاجئة لا تخضع ربما لنظريات العلوم السياسية ولا الدراسات التاريخية، وفي كثير من الأحيان ما تفاجأ المنطقة بعملية تحول كبرى كبيرة فيما يتعلق بالثورات أو غيرها، تفاجأ بها وبعد ذلك نبدأ بالتبرير. إذن في هناك شعور تراكمي لدى الناس بالظلم، بالرغبة في التغيير، لكن هذا التراكم عادة ما يصل إلى نقطة حرجة تدفعهم إلى المشاركة، فإذا أتيحت الفرصة تتوسع المشاركة إلى حالة تغيير. النقطة الأخرى إذا كان في وقت تتعلق أيضا فيما يتعلق بالمرأة. أنا أظن أنه التعليقات كانت جميلة من الزميلة مقدسي، وأنا هنا بلاحظ أنه في الثورات هذه كان في هناك دور هائل وكبير للمرأة في معظم الثورات العربية، وبالذات للإسلاميين من النساء أو للإسلاميات من النساء في البلدان. وراح نلاحظ كمان في الدراسات الاجتماعية، لو نشوف مثلا فيما يتعلق بالجامعات ونقابات العمل إلى آخره، راح نلاحظ أن شعبية الإسلاميين بين النساء هي أعلى من شعبيتهم بين الرجال. وبالتالي هنا العقدة التي ربطت ما بين الحجاب والنقاب وما بين التخلف يجب أن تفك في الدراسات الأكاديمية. كثير من النساء التي المتحجبات التي درسن في الغرب يفخرن بهذا الحجاب، ويعتبرن أن الالتزام بالإسلام وفهم الإسلام بشكل صحيح هو نقطة دافعة في السلوك الإسلامي، لأنه بيعطي الحالة الإسلامية بفهم الصحيح، تعطي حالة رغبة في التغيير، رفض الظلم، وأيضا الرغبة في أن يكون الشعور هذا الديني شعور بيعكس الرغبة في التحرر من قيود الفساد أو غيره، وبالتالي هنا الحجاب لا يصبح عقدة نقص، وإنما بيصبح عنصر جيد ودافع لعمل التغيير، وبالتالي الربط هنا يفترض أنه يكون ربط إيجابي وليس ربط سلبي. وشكرا.
Thank you. Bahagat? Well, why don't you go ahead if you want to make a quick comment, and then we'll, to keep the flow going, and then Bahagat.
شكرا زياد. ما كنت بعرف شو بدي أعمل.
Identify yourself so everybody knows.
For identifying myself, I'm Mohsen Saleh from Al-Zaytuna Center. Thank you.
بسام حداد جورج ميسون يونيفرسيتي. أنا بس بدي أعلق على مسألة واحدة. أنا طبعا بتفق معك إنه ما كان في يعني تركيز على مسألة السببية بالشكل يعني يمكن الواحد بده إياه، بس كان في حديث كتير عن أمور هيكلية. هلا بالنسبة للمسألة الاقتصادية اللي حكيتها بالخصوص عن مصر ويمكن حتى عن تونس، أنا بخاف إنه عم بتعيد إنتاج الخطاب النيوليبرالي يلي بيصدر عن صندوق النقد الدولي أو البنك الدولي، يلي شاف بتونس وبمصر نموذج للتطور الاقتصادي بآخر 10 سنين، وحكيت عن النمو بالشكل الكلي. بس المشكلة إنه توزيع هيدا النمو أو توزيع هيدا الثروة كان من أسوأ ما يكون بمصر بآخر 8 سنين بالذات. ولذلك إنه هيدي مشكلة، مش هيدي بتشكل مشكلة مش نموذج. بس يعني أنا استغربت، أنا فكرتك بدك تطعن بمسألة بهالمسائل، بس رجعت عدت إنتاجهم. فيمكن يعني ما بعرف إذا I don't know if this is the right time، بس بحب إنه أعمل هذا التعليق. وأنا يعني طبعا بكرة عندي أكثر أقوله عن هالموضوع.
Bahagat.
Baga Korani, AUC. I suppose our focus here is really to sharpen the research and advance the initiative. I mean, we are not going to repeat papers about the uprising and things like that. And I'll focus my questions and comments for Nada and Jean on that point. Nada, the ILO is one of the most important organizations that has done work that has been actually as the basis of the uprisings. I mean, unemployment, social safety nets, all of that. I mean, solid research. And yet, that work hasn't been known. It hasn't been listened to. So that is a puzzle. Why is that? Number two, for the transition, the ILO too has the advantage of being one of the very few international organizations that has based itself on tripartite participation. Workers, government, and businessmen. The only organization that has worked on that. And it seems to me for the transition, that is the paradigm that is needed. So can the ILO help promote that paradigm? To Jean, I have just, I don't know if the situation about gender and women is as bleak as we believed. I mean, I have 3 cases where research is done by young people and good research. At AUC, you have the Institute of Gender and Women Studies, and it's very active. Even the Arab League has established the Arab Women Organization. I mean, the Arab League is, we don't need to go very, very in detail, but they have done some surveys, given some scholarships to young ladies, and published actually quite a few volumes about topics that are not covered about women. Then there is AUC Press is publishing a book soon about the Arab Spring, and in that book there is a chapter about gender. Women were part of the revolution. So I think there are instances that things are moving. My question actually comes to what my colleague here has mentioned, and perhaps you didn't have time to develop that. We are in a panel about motivation. What is the linkage? I didn't get the linkage between gender and motivation of the uprising. And perhaps you will have the time to develop that.
Rami.
Thank you very much. Rami Zurek from AUB. I wanted to thank, I'm going to be talking to Nada mostly, I think that's a continuation of a long conversation. And first, I wanted to thank you for introducing the concept of, again, of social protection floor rather than social safety nets. And I actually urge everyone, please, just note this departure from waiting for people to fall than, preventing them from falling through state and governmental and other. But I mean, that's a role for the state. So thanks very much for that. This is about employment. Of course, I'm not going to go through a mechanistic description of the driving forces and whatever. I don't think there is a lot of interest in doing that. But I mean, the issue of employment is prevalent in the Arab world. The issue that people don't have access to dignified employment. I mean, that's something that we cannot deny. Whether it's a driving force, a result, or etc., is irrelevant at that stage, because this is something that any new government is going to have to address. So we are looking more at what do we have to address right now, regardless of the causes, rather than what caused the situation in which we are today. And Nada, a lot of the data that comes out and a lot of the information seems to conflate together rural and urban, while the situation is extremely, extremely, extremely dissimilar, as you probably know yourself. If you take the GCC countries aside, there is still a very, very significant, sometimes more than half, like in Yemen, for example, of the people who live in rural area in conditions of poverty, but more importantly, without hope and of access to any job that can offer any relevance, considering their training, their situation, and the future that is being planned for them by elites, old or new, who take decisions and make decisions from urban area and who think in terms of service economy, tourism, etc., etc. These people this is where most of the poverty exists. And while, I certainly do agree that there are tremendous difficulties in moving towards efficient and effective farming in the Arab world, considering, if anything, just the demand on food and the associated ecological difficulties that confront the Arab world, we still don't have any idea of what do we do with 150 million people who find themselves without a job. And I think the fact that we've had Sidi Boussaid and Port Said and Dar'a, and that the people in Yemen are first generation coming from mountain areas that do not produce enough surplus in order to be able to afford life, has to be factored somewhere into all of this equation, and that therefore any planning, any developmental planning that is to come will have to take this into account. So what's your take on that?
Mehran?
Very quickly, as I was listening to a description of both situation of labor and of women in the lead up to the Arab uprisings, I couldn't help but to be reminded of situation of labor and women in the lead up to the 2009 Green Movement in Iran. And I know that we're focused on the Arab world, but I think it's important to also look at the transnational nature of these phenomena. Women were also on the front. They were the face of the Green Movement in Iran in 2009. And interestingly, a lot of Iranians are looking to see, the average middle-class Iranian is looking to see. First, they think they gave rise to the Arab Spring, but now they're waiting to see how the Arab Spring is going to turn out and how it will affect the Iranian state. And I think it's one research agenda probably for us as we move forward is to look at potential links and interconnectednesses that don't stop at national boundaries or these divisions and go to places like Iran from the Arab world and vice versa. So just wanted to point that out.
Samir?
Thank you, Rami.
Remember to identify yourselves, please.
Samir Maqdisi, AUB. I'll not ask Jean any question. We have plenty of time to talk about these things. But I will. I have to make very two brief points, Rami. One is that to understand what is happening now, why is it that the uprisings have taken place? I think a parallel question is, why did it take such a long time for the uprising to take place. And it took 50, 60 years after independence. And this brings into account what has in the literature well known as the Arab, so-called Arab exceptionalism. And the reason why has this been the case. My question is to Nada. You talked about a new developmental paradigm. Can we really talk about that? I suppose you're not simply talking about macroeconomic stability and rates of economic growth on the IMF, IBRD kind of, criteria for what development is all about, in the sense that development now is multidimensional. And therefore, if you want to talk about a new developmental paradigm, can you do this in the absence of political reform? Can you do it without really having first brought about genuine democratic institutions that look at the development paradigm in this new way of that development is really multidimensional, and that political freedom is part and parcel of development? Thank you.
Issam.
Hisham Sallam, Georgetown University. I was hoping just to follow up really quickly on the earlier conversation, really interesting conversation that was going on about the motivations behind the uprisings, or the fact, maybe to be more precise, the factors that may have led to the uprisings. And I just want to sort of complicate this discussion a little bit by saying that I think we need to distinguish between the inequality of participation in these uprisings. And I'm going to be talking almost exclusively about the Egyptian case. And here I'm talking specifically about the differences between talking about this mass uprising as exclusively a process of mass participation in sort of a nationwide effect, versus talking about it as the aggregation between mass participation and the role that was played by protest movements in organizing, specifically protest movements in Egypt, in organizing the initial demonstrations, the initial protests that actually gave way to mass participation and that culminated in the mass uprisings. Also, and I'm highlighting that difference because the different competing theories about what was really going on, and we've been hearing a lot of those theories lately, like the neoliberal thesis, the Facebook thesis. So that's an important issue. Another issue is the fact that at different stages of the uprisings, I think different factors are important. For example, Professor Dalal earlier that, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood did not play a major role in mobilizing people initially in the uprisings, but they did play a major role in sustaining the uprising in Egypt, in the sense that they have invested a lot of resources, a lot of money in basically very simple logistical, but arguably critical logistical details that were important in maintaining a sustained mass sit-in in Tahrir Square. Simple things that it's easy to lose track of, but things that are important for sustaining this as continued mass occupation and cross-class occupation of that square. So just to complicate the matter a little bit, I think we need to keep track of this issue of the inequality of participation, both across different types and different types of participants in the uprisings, but also sort of this the variable significance of the participation of these different groups across time as well, which also raises a lot of questions about public opinion polls and whether we can just look exclusively on public opinion polls and evaluating all the various existing theories about what was really at play here. Thank you.
Joshua.
My name is Josh Stacker. I'm at Kent State University in Ohio. I just kind of wanted to echo on just thinking about some of the themes that got discussed this morning, and I think that one of the real issues that I know that I'm susceptible to, but I also notice it in some of the conversation going on, is there's a tendency to get so drawn into a case that, when you reference what's going on with the Arab uprisings, like in my mind, I'm like constantly thinking is Egypt as the reference point, which is, not the sort of universal story. And I think that's one thing that Bassam was trying to get out. And I'd like to pick up on something that Mehran said, and not even just think about this regionally, right? These uprisings happen in a sort of global international context. And in that sense, if we fall back into these patterns of trying to fight back against sort of imperial narratives about women or labor, what we end up doing is basically, telling ourselves things that we already know. Instead, what would be interesting, I think, for researchers is trying to kind of undermine those narratives completely from where they're originating. So, for instance, one of the things that I tried to do recently with a colleague in Marip was this idea of global capital, right? And so instead of trying to ask what's the percentage of the military owns in Egypt, which is unknowable, what you can do is you can go find out who is sending money into Egypt, right? And there, we were finding it was all Emirati, all Kuwaiti, Saudi, American, right? And so you had all these links. And so I think that when you kind of take it even wider than what Mehran's saying is really transnational, it really kind of gives these transitions a different dynamic. And I think it rounds it out. And I mean, there's a lot of people in this room that are doing great work on transnationalism, like Toby and Walid. So, I think that may be the way to kind of sharpen the research agenda, is to get out of our cases and look at these sort of, currents of capital, repression, so forth.
Thank you. Ahmed?
Just to go back to the issue of motivations, and I think it's quite clear that some of these things are cumulative. There is no question, inequities, tyranny, and so on and so forth. But I think, a useful way of addressing this question is not so much to repeat, these same verities, but and there is a lot of literature on the subject, is to, for example, ask the question of what are the structural reasons that enabled authoritarian regimes to survive for so long. I think there is literature, and I think the literature in political science literature is quite problematic on this particular subject. And I think there are beginnings, useful beginnings of questioning this literature. So, what are the structural reasons that enabled authoritarianism to survive for this long? And what is it that happened that undermined these structures and enabled the changes that occurred? So this is, I think, a fruitful sort of axis and this is not just to understand the past, because this is, I think, of significance for the future, because these authoritarian structures can reproduce themselves, just as revolutions and uprisings are adjusting and adapting and coming up with new mechanisms. There is also the risk of. So this isn't just about. It's not just a pure academic exercise. It's an exercise which is relevant to the future. Another, I think, important question to ask, and again, not just as a pure academic exercise, is why now? And I think it's important to ask it because it has also ramifications for the future. One thing that I think is important, and we probably will talk about this tomorrow, I think there are very radical changes in terms of the geostrategic landscape in the region. Just remember, about 15 years ago, 10 years ago, I don't know how long it was, there was the initial project of the Bush administration to transform the region. And already by the end of the Bush term, even before Obama, this has changed radically, completely. From a project of controlling and transforming the region into going to bed with Gaddafi. Remember Gaddafi a few years ago was part of the moderate camp, and everyone sort of, we had a sort of presentation by Gaddafi at Georgetown. I don't know if you remember, Issam. And to our credit, we were critical. We didn't play the game, but this is a radical transformation at the geostrategic level, I think, which sets the stage, at least in part, to some of the possibilities of explain why it was possible at this particular moment that what happened actually was possible. Another, I think, useful question to ask is is, and again, this is a question which is largely academic, but also has practical implications, is why we as researchers fail to see some of these developments. I'm sure there are people who would want to claim that that they've always predicted, they were able to predict and whatever, but by and large, most researchers failed to predict or anticipate these developments. And this is a question of, and again, it's about the modes of knowledge production and the context in which we think about. I mean, the role of sort of the ideological platforms that inform the way we think about developments in the region. And then finally, I think the most important question, which will build on all of the above and go beyond, is what next? I mean, there are huge transformations that are taking place in the region, and there is there is need for intensive reflection on these transformations to manage the future, to manage the transformations of the future, and they are quite diverse.
Thank you. Just a logistical note. For those of you standing up, there's some seats up here. There's an extra surcharge, $5 for the seats up here, but you're welcome to have them for free today. And there's a couple of seats up here. Yes. And also, this panel will go to 11:10 because we started late, and the next panel, we only have 3 people, not 4. So the next panel will be 1 hour and 45 minutes instead of 2 hours. So there'll be plenty of time for both panels. Toby.
So, thanks, Rami. So I'm
identify yourself.
Toby Jones. I teach Middle East history at Rutgers. I just want to point out to my fellow historian and former Stanford colleague, Ahmed, not all of us failed to predict that some of this would happen. But it was typically the historians who were in the business of saying that bad news was on the horizon, whereas our colleagues in political science, if you'll forgive me, were and have been structurally dead wrong for the last 30 years or so. So I want to ask something that's complicated and that I don't have necessarily an answer for, but it occurs to me in the context of the conversation and questions of why and motivation. And part of the reason I ask is I often ask it my students, and I teach a class at Rutgers on Iran and Iran's revolution, or at least part of which, and it's, well, why did Iran have a revolution and other parts of the developing world and global south did not, right? Rami, if you asked your questions, or if research centers ask questions about social justice and about economic inequality globally, my suspicion is that broadly you would get similar kinds of answers about governance and about inequality and about the absence of opportunity across the global south, right? So why is it then that there are only uprisings in certain parts of the global south and not others? Which raises the question, what's Arab about the Arab uprisings? I mean, it may be self-evident, right? Well, you only see uprisings in the Arab world. But if you ask an Egyptian whether the Bahraini uprising constitutes part of the Arab Spring, I'm worried that the answer is going to be no, right? Because there's a rhetorical framework to dismiss what happens in Bahrain and some parts of the Arab world, so some places count, other places don't count. So there's a couple of things here. One is, what is it that connects these places, and why isn't Iran's Green Revolution automatically part of the conversation just because it happened a couple of years ago? And then there's a corollary question, why doesn't it happen in other parts of the global south that have authoritarian political systems that have been victimized by neoliberalism over the last 30 years, and so on and so forth. We can follow this path of inquiry sort of infinitely. The other is how should we think about the region as an analytical category? Is the Middle East a thing? And do the Arab uprisings tell us something about how the region is connected? As well as how various participants in these uprisings think about one another. And what does that ultimately tell us about what's Arab about the uprisings?
When can we
After Karim speaks.
Thank you. Karim Magdis here at AUB. The thing is, of course, now there are questions that have been raised by Toby and others, which we're probably going to be addressing tomorrow in another panel. So I'm not sure. I mean, they're very interesting things. I would love to be able to talk as well about this. We're going to talk about it tomorrow, especially the questions that you're asking now. But just to go back a little bit to the panel itself, and in a sense to continue some of this conversation, which is, I did also want to connect more with the global story and to say, that much of the conversations that happen here within the UN and within other sectors covering the Arab uprisings is that it's the discussions of injustice, for instance, is in a sense decontextualized from the larger international frame. And so actually, just to ask specifically whether or not, is there something going on, because you hear a lot about the UN, the UN itself, the UN, of course, has many different agencies that are, as we know, I worked in the UN for a couple of years, and so we know, of course, there's a lot of competition, even within UN agencies, as to who's doing what and who's taking the lead on what and what kind of concepts come up at any point. But is the UN learning anything from the Arab uprisings, and is there some kind of internal conversation that we can talk about, so that when conversations about injustice comes up in the ILO, it does connect to other aspects, the trade aspects, the economic aspects, the financial aspects that the UN deals with, the UNDP in particular, because UNDP plays a prominent role in many of the countries here. And if anybody has been accused in some countries anyway of pushing a new liberal agenda over recent years, and UNDP is one of them that comes up there. So what is the relationship between UNDP, ILO, and the different UN agencies in trying to come up with, trying to understand itself as a primary actor in the discussions of concepts like injustice and poverty and development and these kinds of things? So I'd appreciate an answer on that. Thank you.
Just one more question from the audience, George, and then Bassam.
شكرا. جورج صيفي، مدير دار التنمية حاليا وسابقا مناضل في صفوف الأسكوا ل 30 سنة. سوف أركز مداخلتي على ما تفضلت به الأخت ندى، ولكن أود أن أطرح نقطة أساسية. أعتقد أن التفسير الأساسي لما يحصل حاليا في الدول العربية يجب أن ينطلق من طبيعة الدولة العربية، هذه الدولة التي ما زالت قبلية بالأساس وليست دولة المؤسسات. يعني وأعتقد أننا سوف نطور هذه الفكرة في المناقشات اللاحقة. أما بالنسبة لما تفضلت به الأخت ندى أقول التالي وأجاوب تقريبا ما تفضل به كريم. كوني عملت 30 سنة بالأمم المتحدة طرحت على نفسي بالأحرى كيف يمكن أن تقوم هذه الثورات العربية في أكثر من بلد، ولم نكن نحن في مرحلة لاستباق واستكشاف هذه المراحل، خاصة في تونس التي كانت تعطى كنموذج للدول المتقدمة في أكثر من مرحلة. إذن ما توصلت إليه هو التالي: أولا على مستوى مؤشرات التنمية، إن المؤشرات التنمية التي نستعملها في الأمم المتحدة هي مؤشرات تنحصر في الجانب الكمي وليس في الجانب الإجمالي. وأعتقد أحد الأمثلات الرئيسية هنا أن ندخل على المؤشرات الكمية مؤشرات نوعية. مثلا تم الكلام عن التوزيع، هذه شغلة مهمة. مثلا إذا أخذنا دليل التنمية البشرية، هناك النمو الاقتصادي، هناك التعليم، وهناك توقع الحياة، الصحة، توقع الحياة عند الولادة. توزيع النمو الاقتصادي غير وارد بشكل عام. الأهم المؤشر الثاني المهم الذي يجب إدخاله هو مؤشرات الفساد، ويجب أن تدخل ضمن هذا المؤشر العام. أعطي مثال آخر، قصة قياس الفقر ومؤشر $1 a day $2 a day etc. أنا أعتقد هذا مؤشر غير صحيح. ليه؟ لأنه في بعض الدول $1 a day، الدولار الواحد في اليوم، هو أقل من الأبجكت بوفرتي، الفقر المدقع. ويجب أن نتعامل مع البلدان حسب الوقائع، يعني لأنه قد يكون $1 a day أقل من الفقر المدقع وقد يكون أكثر. إذن يجب واحد يطور هذه العملية. لفتة أخيرة بالنسبة لدول الخليج ومعدلات التعطل. الحقيقة دول الخليج يجب أن يكون الاهتمام بها على مستويين: مستوى المواطنين وغير المواطنين. المستوى العام بضيع. يعني إذا أخذنا أي دولة خليجية معدل التعطل العام عادة هو في حدود 2-3%. إذا فصلناه مواطن غير مواطن نجد معدل التعطل ضمن المواطنين 14 و15%. هذه في دول تستخدم الأيدي العاملة الأجنبية. وشكرا.
Thank you. Last two questions here, Nabil and then Marika, and then we'll come back to the speakers and we'll finish up. You'll have many more opportunity. No, Bassam, sorry. I forgot Bassam. And then the speaker. Taib, go ahead. Go make your comment and then Nabil and...
I just want to say I'm not usually a defender of the discipline, but I just want to thank the historians for predicting the uprisings for the last 30 and 40 years that it's going to come. Thank you. Yeah, it's like saying Bashar Assad is going to fall tomorrow, no tomorrow, no tomorrow. And then after a few years, look, it happened. So it's just like Daniel Lerner and Karl Deutsch of the modernization theorists in the 1950s, who now will say, oh, look, they're revolting finally. It's as a result of the brilliance of modernization theory. I just want to thank you.
Nabil, Fadal.
Okay, Nabil Dajani, AUB. I'd like to hammer on a subject that has been possessing me for...
Speak right into it. Hold it straight.
Okay, I'll keep it away. As I said, I'd like to hammer on a subject that has been occupying me for some time. Basically, that our failure to interpret or understand social change or movements in the Arab world is not because we don't have enough data. We have abundance of data. The problem is that we are unable to fit these data in proper frames, in proper models. And we have been using basically foreign models, Western models, to fit in these. If I have a car, a Toyota, I cannot use the parts of a Cadillac or a Mercedes to store that. I have to understand the Toyota and look at it as a Toyota and see how the Toyota functions. And the problem is, in the Arab world, we have been carrying the hammer, the banner of democracy, democracy, democracy. Democracy may be a Western value. In the Arab world, it is a value, but it's not really high on the order of priorities in the Arab world. And trying to interpret and understand change in the Arab world by a yearn for democracy basically is a serious problem. I think, Rami, you referred to some of the other factors. Social justice, pride, all of these are very important issues that we need to consider, we need to focus. We need, what I believe is that we need now to look at different frames. We need to develop different frames. We have to forget about, the idea of globalization has destroyed our orientation in trying to understand our society, because we're blinded by this call for globalization. What we need is to look into regional, cultural frames, and through these regional cultural frames, let's try to fit the data we have. We have abundance of data. By doing this, we will be more able, I believe, to understand social change and social movements. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question,
Marika Bosman from the Osprey Foundation.
Put it closer.
Closer, like this? Okay, Marika Bosman from the Osprey Foundation. I have a question for Nada. Given the problems you mentioned of enormous unemployment, the informal sector, also I suppose globalization and so on, and the weak situation of the labor unions, do you think there is a role for the labor unions in the future, and what it would be particularly in terms of helping unemployed people, and how they can be strengthened if there is a role for them?
Thank you. We'll go back to Nada and Jean, give them 5 minutes each, and then we'll stop at 11:10 so we can keep the schedule on time.
Well, that makes it easier, 5 minutes each. Let me just say, a year ago, in April 2011, I sat with Dominique Strauss-Kahn in the IMF, along with Rashid Khalidi. We were in public, and it was a big meeting. And Rashid Khalidi and Mustafa Nabli, the central bank governor of Tunisia, and Wael Ghunaim of Egypt. And Wael Ghunaim read out the paragraph of the latest IMF report on Egypt to Dominique Strauss-Kahn, which lauded, as someone mentioned, the achievements of Egypt, the outstanding achievements in education and gender and economic growth and distribution and so on. And Dominic Strauss-Kahn said, yes, you were right, we made some errors of judgment. And Wael Ghnaim said, you know what, they were crimes. They were not errors of judgment. So what we're talking about in the new development paradigm is exactly that, is how you move away from a model which seems to have produced some growth without equity, but certainly without jobs as well. And I'm really going to just concentrate on this because I could say a lot about everything else. And the lesson of the past is that it is not possible without democratic reform, and I think that was part of the co-optation model of before. You know, please have some education and health and so on, but just forget about the rest. Clearly, what we're talking about is that if the other elements of inclusion and participation are not included, it's not sustainable. So I think that's a very big issue. Yes, we are working on this on the international level. This is a global quest, and I think the financial crisis has hit home. You know, we used to be the region with the largest youth unemployment. We're now second to Europe. I mean, Spain is struggling with a youth unemployment figure of about 40%. And I think that dynamic is very important for us to learn and to understand and to put it in the global context. And the global context is for us in the ILO to look at social justice and the implications of globalization on economic and social impact. And that's a very big area of study and of work. Let me say to Rami, part of what's been missing is, of course, agricultural and industrial policy, because we have none, and where we have seen them, really the mix of incentives and the links to productivity are very low, and the challenge of the informal economy is a very big one, and these are one of our biggest priorities. In terms of what we have been able to do, or whether people or listen, the earliest demands from Egypt and Tunisia, the new governments when they came, were for help on minimum wage, on youth employment schemes, on the economic empowerment of women, on freedom of association. So this thing of the role of trade unions and so on, yes, in theory we should have had a bigger role, but you know what? The revolutions uncovered the weakness, the fragility of these institutions. In fact, the trade unions of the region are simply mouthpieces for government. Where they are democratic, they are being hammered, and I take the case of Bahrain at the moment, where we have one of the most vibrant federations of trade unions in the Arab world, and paying a very big price for it, with a rate of dismissals, summary job dismissals of over 3,000 workers in such a small population. So it is a very serious issue. The priority is really not that we're not giving the advice, but that we need to work together on employment policies, on labor market information systems. I don't agree we have all the data. There are huge gaps in our data, certainly in qualitative data, but also quantitative data, especially in the area of protection, where we really are trying to find out a lot more, I think, of what is happening. A big part of the solution will be to build the capacity all over again of these employers and workers' organizations. The private sector has been silent in these revolutions. There is a charge there of complicity, bigger than ours, Karim, as the UN, but I think the role of a private sector in terms of enlightened interests of workers, but also national interests, is going to be up for grabs. And we're working very closely with the reconstitution of chambers of commerce and industry at this period. If I have a minute more on the question of a lot of busting of myths. You know, we went through a lot on the skills mismatch, this idea the education system is not producing what we need, but our young people are getting employed in other places. The real issue is what investments we're making and what type of skills and training development. And Arab employers complain the most, the private sector in the Arab world, but it invests the least in apprenticeships and on-the-job training. So we have to go back a little bit more closely to what were some of the underpinnings that led to this scale of underemployment and mass employment and unemployment all over. On the issue of the United Nations, I learned a long time ago to stop defending the United Nations. I'll talk about my part. Clearly, there was a reconsideration internally and a reflection, because we were part of, you know, we supported the First Ladies Clubs, and we went along with all this, I think up to a point and with some room for maneuver. And I recall really the Arab Human Development reports, and I was very proud to have been part of the production of those 4 reports, where we started to take a role in understanding a little bit better what was going on and sounding the warnings, I think. We do have a strategic response plan, which is an integrated UN plan in the Arab states region, and we have been working together on it. And we have actually country-level plans as well. So we are all working together on a transition for Yemen, the transitional plan of 2 years. We are working together on the humanitarian response in Syria, and we are collaborating on the response to Basuni and other of our own reports in Bahrain. So yes, sometimes we do come together. And I agree with George, of course, that the indicators need to be revisited, and I think that's part of the effort that we are making right now. A big challenge is workers. We've just established a $2 million regional project to support workers' literacy, legal, economic, and social literacy. And the task is really across the Arab world to get back to basics. First of all, to rejuvenate these unions, to include more women, and to make sure that they are more representative and more engaged in the key issues of today. So that's a very tall order.
1 second.
The Human Development Index has been now adjusted to account for inequality. If you look at the 2000, I think what we are right in saying this should be expanded to account for, say, Polity 4 indices and other issues that will make it more, development in the sense that now we understand it. I just wanted to draw your attention to this point. Thank you.
Just one thing I want to say, that in addition to watching the countries of change and civil unrest, there is a typology, and we are looking very closely at the countries that we're calling countries of mitigation, which is those countries that have stated that their objective is to reform and to take on the challenge, and I mean Morocco and Jordan, Oman, where there are interesting experiences and where we believe we should be really supporting our tripartite partners, certainly workers, employers, and governments, to try to respond before they also go the wrong way or go further the wrong way. Before they go in the wrong direction. Zafi Aman.
Thank you. I would just like to reiterate something I said earlier in order to get into something else. But what we were asked to do today was discuss the motivation, and what I said was I don't want to discuss the motivation of women because it seems to me quite obvious. It's the same as the motivation of any other sector of society, and Nada has certainly shown at least the economic aspect of it and the whole business of it. Second of all, when I was talking about hijab and all of this, I meant absolutely no value judgment on or against, or with or against these things. I think that the whole business of women's costume in this part of the world is essential to be discussed. We must analyze it, we must understand it in its historical context. There is no controversy whatsoever in India about wearing the sari, the beautiful sari that they wear. So why there should be this massive controversy in our part of the world about hijab and abaya and things, it's beyond me. But it has something to do with a very important point, which is why I've been trying to push the business of women's studies and understanding history. Nobody in the whole world is as stereotyped as Arab women, especially Muslim women, but Arab women as well. Christian women have no say. They're not even mentioned in the picture, by the way. So it seems to me that this business of stereotyping that we've been fighting for many years is essential to understanding the nature of our society. Because if we don't understand how our society works, then we can't understand anything else in it, including the revolts. One of the questions that I wanted to discuss really is the whole business of what does political participation of women mean? What is political participation? What is the nature of political participation? Is it only the number of women in parliament, or the number of women in high civil society, in high civil administration posts, or people like Nada or people like Hillary Clinton and Indira Gandhi and Margaret Thatcher and all these other monsters that have been given credit for being women in power? What is political participation? And you've just been talking about indices. Of course, in the economic thing, there have been all these indices. For instance, in the whole business of women's labor, which is not accessible, which is difficult to assess in terms of the normal. Okay, I'm done. There have been all these alternative indices, right, which have been created, the Gender Inequality Index, the Social Institutions and Gender Index, the Global Gender Gap Index, the Women's... This has all been done in economics, in the study of economics. Has it been done in the study of political science and political institutions? What does the participation of women mean? How did it change from the days of the Ottoman Empire, for instance, today? Ahmed said there has been a lot of work on this. Fine, we need to get it into the public consciousness. What happened to women? Where is the missing link? Where is the link between public participation on a massive scale throughout modern Arab history and then this total absence of women in what you normally call politics? What does it mean? I also just wanted also to make a brief point about the business of the work, being that, of course, there's been tons of work, especially in Egypt, and Egyptian scholars are marvelous, and they are producing a lot, but it still hasn't penetrated the public consciousness. People are still referring to the story of Huda Sha'rawi. Yesterday, I was at a luncheon where someone said, "Shufu shu sar Huda Sha'rawi 100 years ago, and here we are, and the hijab is all over." There is a total misunderstanding of our own history, and we must understand it. In this particular country, women are so poorly regarded, really, as a subject and as a cultural entity, that there's very little interest in it. But I still think it's absolutely of the essence. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you to the panelists and all the participants.